Hello, everybody. This is Mr. Peoples again, and we're here to talk about the new wave of immigration. Um, Talk about how immigrants came to our country in that time period after the Civil War. And your learning target today is that you can describe challenges faced by immigrants entering the United States. And you're going to experience some of those challenges when we do our Ellis Island experience. And let's get started. All right. Before the Civil War, before the 1880s, the group of immigrants that came to the United States were mostly from places like Britain, Germany, Ireland, and Scandinavia. So if we were to go to a map, this is a map of Europe, and the old immigrants came from places like Britain, Ireland, Scandinavia, which is up here, Germany. Those are the places where most of the old immigrants came from, and they came to the United States from those countries. But let's take a look at where the new immigrants came from. Well, let's talk about these immigrants first. When these immigrants came to the country, these immigrants were mostly skilled workers. They had specific skills, like they knew how to make shoes, or they were good at something specific that they'd been trained in. And when they came to America, they came to become farmers. And so those people that made up the Great Plains, the people that were involved in the Dakota conflict, those settlers were the old immigrants that came to the United States, the people that settled Minnesota. But after 1880, a new group of immigrants starts to come to the United States. And these new immigrants are from places in Southern and Eastern Europe. And this included Czechs, Greeks, Hungarians, Italians, Poles. So if I were to show you on this map again, the new immigrants came from this area right here. And this area, these are the places where the new immigrants came from. And these immigrants came to our country, and they didn't come looking for skilled jobs. They came looking for jobs in factories. And so they were looking for a specific place, and their goal was to get job opportunities. They had heard that the United States was a place where people could come and that needed workers, and so they were willing to come to start a brand new in the United States. Now, many of them were trying to also escape horrible conditions in their country. And they had heard about the United States as being this place where they could start brand new. And so many of these new immigrants came to America wanting job opportunities and planning to settle in cities. Here's a couple pictures of these new immigrants. This is a picture of immigrants from southern Italy around the year 1911. Notice how they're dressed. Notice the baggage that they're carrying. We're going to try and imitate some of these clothes when we do our Ellis Island experience. And then here are children, immigrant children at Ellis Island. And when I look at pictures like this, I like to think of my great-grandparents came through Ellis Island. And I like to look at this picture and think of like my great-aunt who came through Ellis Island as a little girl. Looking in this picture and seeing maybe that's my great-aunt in there somewhere. 1 out of every 4 people in America can trace a relative of theirs as coming through Ellis Island. So 1 out of 4 of you in this class might have someone related to you in this picture. Now, the journey to America was not easy. It was actually very difficult. And one of the reasons why it was difficult is the immigrants had to travel by ship. And usually, because they didn't have very much money, they traveled in an area of the ship known as steerage, which is the area below the ship's deck. It's where the steering mechanisms are located. And it wasn't like there were beds for everybody. They had to sleep usually on the floor, or if there were cots, they were packed in with like 15, 20, 30 other people, all kind of lumped in there together. And then once they did get to America, now this ship ride might take 2 weeks, and in that 2 weeks you might have such rough seas that you're getting sick every day from seasickness. But once you make it through the trip on the ship, then you had to go to an immigration center and be processed by the government. And so these new arrivals would go to this immigration center, these immigration and processing centers. And the biggest one in America was Ellis Island. Okay, and at these processing centers, immigrants were questioned, asked questions like if they were a criminal or if what they were wanting to do in America, and then they were examined physically. There were a couple things that would keep you out of America if you were an immigrant. One is if you were a criminal or you had plans to be a criminal when you came to the United States. They wouldn't let criminals in. Two, if you had any kind of medical problem, they didn't want that medical problem spreading to other Americans. And so they would hold you in a hospital until it was time, till you were okay and not contagious. And then once you were not contagious, then they would let you continue on to America. And then the other reason is if your papers weren't in order, then you wouldn't be allowed to come in. Maybe you didn't have a passport or things like that. Those things weren't together. Those are the main reasons why people wouldn't be allowed to come in. But everybody was physically examined, everybody was questioned, and everybody's papers were checked. Now, some immigrants, like I was saying, were kept at these processing centers for weeks or months until they were healthy. And then they were usually allowed to go on. Now, imagine you're traveling in a family of 4, and one of your family is found to be sick. You don't leave usually. You would stay with your family member. You wouldn't leave your child or your brother or your mother or father there at Ellis Island and go to America. You would all leave together. So while one of your family members is at the hospital getting healthy, the other 3 would be asked to stay at Ellis Island and almost be stuck there until their loved one was found healthy. You're going to hear more about this in class when we go over the immigrant story and we listen to actual people that came through Ellis Island. Now, the immigration centers, there was one for each region of the United States. On the East Coast, Ellis Island in New York Harbor was the busiest immigration center. It opened in 1892. Millions of immigrants came through Ellis Island over the next 40 years. 98% of the immigrants that went through Ellis Island were allowed to enter the country. So only 2% were ever turned away. Okay, and we'll talk more about that in class. Now, on the West Coast by California, there was an island called Angel Island near San Francisco. And that opened in 1910, and it was the entrance for many Chinese immigrants. But there was some discrimination here. While there was no real restrictions for Europeans coming to the United States, if a Chinese person wanted to come to the United States, by law, only Chinese whose fathers were already U.S. citizens were allowed into the country. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in class, but it made it difficult for Chinese to enter the United States. And Angel Island had a much more difficult screening system, and many of the people that went to Angel Island were actually sent back to China and to those other Asian countries. Now, in the South, El Paso, Texas had been the main processing center for immigrants from Mexico. Many of those immigrants settled in the Southwest and found work in construction, steel mills, mines, and on large commercial farms, just like the European immigrants and the Asian immigrants that came in. Many found work in construction and steel mills and in those mines. Now, once they arrived in America, there were still some challenges that they faced. Many immigrants moved into neighborhoods with others from the same country. This way they could hear their own language, they could eat familiar foods, and keep some of their customs. Business owners often helped new immigrants by offering credits and loans. Some communities formed groups called benevolent societies, and these benevolent societies would help immigrants in cases of sickness or unemployment or death. But many immigrants, when they came to America, one of their challenges was that they lived in these tenements, these poorly built, overcrowded apartment buildings. And then once they had their job, usually their job was low paying, and it was an unskilled job. So it was a job that you did the same thing over and over again, usually for 10, 12, 14 hours a day. Most of these jobs were in the garment factories where they made clothes, or steel factories, or in construction. And these the immigrants, many of them worked long hours for little pay, and they even worked in those tenement buildings, those apartments, these small shops called sweatshops, which is where they made this clothing. Sometimes immigrants with appropriate skills found work in other occupations. Others borrowed money, saved money, shared money to open up their small businesses, and but it wasn't easy. It was very difficult for a new immigrant to come to America. Many of those immigrants were not thinking about themselves as much as they were thinking about their children, and that whatever hardships they had to live through, they knew that their children, all of that hardship was for their children, that their children wouldn't have to live through those things. And so many of them took that attitude as they lived and worked here in America. Some other challenges is that America wasn't very welcoming. There were a lot of people in America that had anti-immigrant feelings. And as immigration increased, more and more people in America said, hey, we don't want more immigrants. There was a couple reasons why. Americans saw immigrants as a threat to their jobs. Oh, those new immigrants are going to take jobs that other Americans could have. And then the other part of it was strictly racial and ethical. There were prejudices, discrimination against certain races and ethnicities. And some of these things eventually could cause violence. And some people were violent toward immigrants. And even the government even went so far as passing laws to limit immigration, specifically Chinese immigration. Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which limited who could come into the United States. And like I said, other laws restricting convicts, immigrants with diseases, and those that needed help, public assistance from entering the country. Okay, so like I said, we're going to talk a little bit more in class. You're going to experience going through an immigration center in our Ellis Island simulation. But we're going to talk a little bit more about this in class. So hopefully you have some questions and we can answer those in class. Thank you very much.